Thank you for joining us on our journey here to preserve the history of mixed martial arts. When I wanted to take on this project, I needed help. I brought in one of my favorite matchmakers, Miguel Iturrate, and the MMA detective, Mike Davis. So to do this, we've been able to preserve history. Welcome and enjoy. All right, welcome, Lytes Out podcast fan members. We have a special show today. Now, you know, one of our favorite things to do, you know, the deep dives. We get in and we usually go in with fighters and we talk, you know, in depth into their career and other important people to the sport. I don't know if it gets any more important than this. So very, very special person on this one. The original creator of UFC 1, 2, 3, the guy who started the whole thing. Art Davie, very happy to have you here. Thank you so much. You know, we've had a lot of this, the beginning guys on here. We had the polar bear on here. You know, we had
Fred Edish.
Pardon me?
Edish.
Oleg. We had
Oleg,
did a great interview with
you
Oleg.
know, Bosrud, and we've had a lot of the old school guys, but they would never have been here had it not been for this man. None of the three of us would be around here who do the podcast regularly if it weren't for Art. So Art, how the hell are you, sir?
Chris, I really appreciate that introduction. I'm doing great. And it's always great to talk to people who have a history and roots back in the early years of MMA. You know, if you're talking about Chris Lytle, you got to remember that Chris did at least a dozen pancrase events.
Yeah,
There you go.
Hey, there you go.
Absolutely.
We're gonna get into it. I'm gonna hand it off to Mike here in a second. But I gotta ask you, where in New York are you from, man?
Brooklyn, New York, but of course.
There you go. That's always good to get the New Yorkers on here. I'm from Flushing, Queens, so we're gonna represent here.
A federal offense.
Oh,
Yeah, there we go. So Art, like, I read your book, you know, first and foremost, it's called Is This Legal? And like, we're a history podcast here. And in regards to like documentation, that might be one of the most important things ever written on a sport of mixed martial arts. You concentrate on UFC 1. Sean Wheelock co-wrote it with you. And you know, I am a fan of reading and books, and independent books in particular. There isn't a single grammar or spelling error in your book. And the amount of time and love that both of you and Sean, put into that project is incredible. Again, and I sincerely appreciate something like that exists.
Thank you, Mike. I got to tell you that Sean Wheelock was a big factor in making that book a success. And I'll tell you why. I had been approached by a number of people, including, you know, the editor of Grappling and Gladiator magazine, Trent Hester, Todd Hester back in the day. And I had always turned down an opportunity to write the book. But when Sean approached me, he had a couple of things that he said were key. We kept it in mind when we wrote the book. And that was, keep it in the present tense. Do not refer to events that happened afterwards. Let's concentrate on UFC 1, because without UFC 1, admittedly, there'd be no other UFCs. And of course, the impact on MMA in general. And Sean and I talked about the fact that we wanted to give everyone credit, because it took a lot of people being involved and being recruited for this loon shot. And that's what it was. It was a loon shot. Not a moon shot, it was a loon shot. And I was the chief lunatic. And Sean said to me, you don't need to overly praise or knock anybody. Let everyone's actions speak for themselves, including your own. If you made mistakes, if you blew things at the time, tell people about that. The book will work better. Sean was a great student of history. He would say, if you read a book about the Revolutionary War, you know that the U.S. won at the end and General Washington becomes the president, but you've got to keep people turning pages at the end of every chapter. And keeping that in mind, that's what we did with the book.
Chris, Miguel, I'm telling you, it's unapologetic. It's raw. It's gritty. I mean, Art, you know, that East Coast, like grit, you know, I'm not trying to use that word twice, you know, that you know, is associated with New York. It comes out in this book, and it's unapologetically yourself. You know, we're all flawed human beings and characters. We all got little edges to us. And, it's phenomenal. Like it's difficult to put into words how important I believe that book is.
Thank you, Mike. But in all fairness, I said in a number of interviews, I'm the luckiest guy in the world because I was at the right place at the right time. If somebody had tried to do this maybe 5 years earlier or 5 years later, who knows what would have happened? So sometimes luck is a factor of just being in the right place in the universe when lightning wants to strike. That was a big part of it. And I don't mind giving credit to that and to the people that I was able to recruit. Because in all fairness, if I was a lunatic, I was successful at recruiting Orion Gracie, who was a little crazy, Bob Myrowitz, who was a little crazy, and I recruited 7 of the 10 fighters for the first event. And believe me, they had to be willing to put themselves on the line. Their reputation. They had to be embarrassed because now you were going to prove whether or not you were the ultimate fighter. So you got to give credit across the board. And thank you, Mike, for that. I appreciate it.
Okay. So we start in Denver, obviously. That's where UFC 1 was. What else, first off, why Denver, and what other cities were on the short list, and what made you choose that city ahead of the other ones?
Very simply, they had done the Sabaki Challenge, a bare knuckle karate tournament in January of that year. And there was a loophole in the Colorado state law which allowed bare knuckle fighting. That was a big factor. Lulu Niemeyer, the son of the man who designed the city of Brasilia in Brazil, had come to California. He was a friend of Rorion Gracie's, and he was a big concert promoter in Brazil. And originally the idea was to do the entire event on Halloween, 1993 in Brazil, with Lulu Niemeyer, who brought Frank Sinatra to Maracanã Stadium in Brazil. So we were looking all over, but quite frankly, when I looked at the US of A, I realized that there was going to be very few states which would allow bare knuckle fighting. Colorado, to answer your question, was the answer. And with the success of the bare knuckle challenge, Sabaki Challenge, we did it, by the way, in the same arena, McNichols Arena, where the Nuggets played. So there's the answer to your question. That's why Denver. That's why 1993.
That's smart.
Mike, you mind if I jump in real quick?
Yeah, 100%, dude.
Going a little bit before this, we're focused on Denver. Denver didn't just happen. How long did it take? When did the idea originate, and how long did it take you to make this dream come to fruition?
Well, I had actually been thinking about this since the late 1989. And you got to remember, and I mentioned it in the book, I got my butt kicked by a wrestler when I was 18 years old. I was training to go into the Golden Gloves, and I wound up sparring with a wrestler on the beach on Long Island, Peconic Bay. And I got my butt taken down, and I had to tap out. So that stuck in my head. So I had been thinking about this for a while. When I was in the service in the Marines, everybody would argue about the fact, hey, is Taekwondo better than karate? Is judo better than jiu-jitsu? Could Muhammad Ali beat Bruce Lee? So this idea was not a new idea. So in 1989, I was working in an ad agency, and I was taking some Muay Thai classes in Studio City in California. And I had this idea in my head that this could be done. I had started to assemble everything I could find in the library. There was no internet in those days. So I would go to the library and I would look up, had anybody ever done anything with a mixed match? And I found out that it wasn't a new idea. It had been in the Olympics for 1,000 years. It was called pankration. Until the Roman Emperor Theodosius I banned it for being too pagan and too violent, and then it vanished. This was not a new idea. So I had assembled all these articles, all these reports. I studied the Muhammad Ali versus Antonio Inoki match in 1970, which was promoted by Vince McMahon Sr. here in the States, which was a box office flop. And I realized that when it came to some sort of a mixed match event, a true kumite, there were two problems. Number one, what were the rules going to be? One guy would argue, I could do this, I could wear that. And the other guy would say, no, you can't do. And then they would argue about the purse. I'm more famous than you, so I should get the lion's share. I knew if I solved those two problems, that was a big part of it. In my research, I had discovered an article, Mike, in Playboy magazine called BAD, B-A-D. And it was an article about the Gracies and the Gracie Challenge. So I had just begun to work for a new ad agency in Torrance, California. I was literally within walking distance of the Gracie Academy. And I went over there and knocked on the door, and I talked to a couple of people. Orion wasn't there. I left my business card. Weeks later, they answered Chris's question, how did this happen? Weeks later, I finally got a call from Orion's wife, who said to me, are you a Hollywood guy? Are you a producer? Who are you? Because we got this card, but it's something with advertising, but, are you interested in taking classes? I want to meet your husband. I went in and met Horian, and I rolled on the mat, and I was blown away. 20 minutes on the mat, rolling with Horian, and I said, I'm fascinated. He said, why don't you join the class? He was converting all of the old cards where he had been teaching over in his garage in Torrance to the new cards at the new academy. And he wound up taking out a card, and he said, you're going to be student number 1. I was the first registered student in the Gracie Academy. So I began taking classes, and I was fascinated. But to get back to Chris's question, I kept saying to Horian, the Gracie Challenge, do you have $100,000? Not quite. I said, is anybody else showing up with $100,000? He said, no. I said, so the Gracie Challenge is an empty promise. He said, well, I wouldn't say it. I said, well, let me say that. Horian would listen to me, and I guess he thought to himself, who's this little Italian guy? Comes in, and I used to wear a 3-piece suit in those days, and I wasn't that good. I would roll with him. I rolled once with Elio, and I rolled with Hoyler. So he probably thought to himself, who the heck is this guy? He talks fast like Joe Pesci. He sounds like he comes from another part of the country. And Horian, for a year, listened to me and went in one ear and out the other. So finally, at Christmas time, I said, Horian, do you have any names, mailing list of people who have gone to your seminars? Oh, you see, I got about 25,000 names. I said, you got how many names? 25,000. I said, if I could show you a way to turn those 25,000 names into $100,000 cash, would you let me do it? He said, what are you going to do it? I said, I'm going to do a direct mail piece. He said, isn't that junk mail? He said, I've been in America long enough to know that's junk mail. I said, I know how to do that. And the ad agency I'm working in is the biggest ad agency west of the Mississippi in direct mail. So I did a piece for him, and we sent it out. And of course, we brought in $150,000 in 6 weeks. And Horian, when I came into the office, I said, what do we do next? I said, I'm glad you asked that. Yeah. Because I had started to write out, this is the answer to Chris's question, I had started to write out the basic idea of a plan. I knew that I couldn't get this sold to broadcast TV or cable. I figured they were going to say, you guys are nuts.
Yeah.
But wait a minute, it belongs on pay-per-view. And the other idea that I had, which was smart, I said, we can't have just your brother Rickson fighting a kickboxer someplace. I said that 2 parties, the wrong way to do it. Everyone who's tried to do a mixed match that way has failed, including Muhammad Ali, Vince McMahon, and Antonio Inoki. I said, we're going to have an 8-man tournament. I said, could any of your brothers defeat 3 different opponents in one night on a TV show? He said, no problem. I said, then you're in. And I went out and wrote a business plan, 65 pages. And Horian and I then formed a company. And I had already investigated, to answer Chris's question, I had investigated Colorado. And I began to negotiate with McNichols Arena. I was able to get it by late 1992, early 93 for $4,000 rental fee.
Awesome.
Ooh, nice.
Which was peanuts back in those days.
Wow.
And I realized that Horian had a lot of students who were interesting. I used to run into John Milius. Milius and I would be there on a Saturday morning when one of the Gracie brothers would roll with some black belt that had come in from some karate academy. And it always was the same result. They would end up on the mat tapping out. And one day I'm standing next to Milius and I said, I know you from somewhere. And we got talking and I realized this is the guy who wrote the great scene in Jaws, among other things. He made a star out of Arnold Schwarzenegger in Conan the Barbarian. And he's a Gracie student, and he's got a class of private on the same rink that I've got a class on. I would sometimes see him over at the juice bar, and we'd be getting, a grapefruit juice together. So I thought to myself, if I can get him to attach his name to this plan, so then I went out to HBO, Showtime, ESPN. I went out to anybody I could in the pay-per-view business, and everybody basically said the same thing to me. Are you crazy?
Yeah.
And I said to Horian, if we were going to do this, I said, I'm going to need a referee. What about we get Judo Gene LaBelle? And Horian had worked with him on a heart-to-heart TV show. I don't like Judo Gene. He said, you could never bring him in as a referee. I said, what about Chuck Norris? He said, Norris and I are friendly, but we had a falling out over a fee that I was supposed to get when I was supposed to go with him to do a seminar. He said, I thought the fee was just for me. And he said, if one of my brothers, you had to pay $5,000 for each of them. He said, so we're not getting along too well. I said, call him up, let's go over to his house. We go over to his house. I had written out all the bullet points of what we were going to do on a 7x5 card. And I said, Horian, I said, you go in and make peace with him about that $5,000 fee. And I said, then don't start talking to him about this world's best fighter tournament. Don't talk about it. Say, I'm going to bring this great, crazy guy in. He's like Joe Pesci. You're going to like him. And he'll explain it all. I'm waiting in the car, Mike, for 20 minutes. Nothing's happening. Finally, Horian comes out and he says to me, he just kept asking me the same question. I said, what question? I said, what'd you tell him? He said, I started to talk about it. I know I wasn't supposed to, but he kept saying to me, is this legal? So that's where the title of the book came from.
The book.
That's it.
Wallace was asked if he wanted to be, you want to be ringside? Would you be a commentator? He didn't want to be a referee. He didn't want to be a commentator. He didn't want to be ringside. I guess he thought that the state police and the Marines were going to show up. He kept saying, is this legal? So that's the end of Chuck Norris. So Horian had to bring in two Brazilians who had been involved in Vale Tudo, Elio Vigio, who had been the chief of police in Rio de Janeiro, among other things, and
all right. So essentially, like what you're talking about is the two referees for the event. You're talking about Elio Vigio and Joao Barreto. Okay, so that's Art. We can listen to this all day long. I mean, it's this is stuff that's like super important to us, and that's like in my line of questions, like who, what, why, how. So, like, let's kind of bring it back to like UFC 1. Like the walk up to UFC 1 is incredible. Like it's brilliant in the book. But your original sponsor was Gold's Gym.
That's true.
Okay, so how, if it's okay, would you mind telling us how much they paid for the event as a sponsor? And they never sponsored another one after that. So what was the conversations like afterward? I'm sure it didn't go well, and it was probably an interesting conversation.
The funny event was that where I lived in Torrance, I had a girl who worked in that same building, and I was managing that building, and she was a masseuse. And she had worked on Ken Wall, who was a great Mr. Olympia competitor, and she knew a number of the top bodybuilders, and she introduced me to people over at Gold's Gym. Well, when I got out of the service, the guy who was competing for Mr. America, was people who wanted to buy in Gold's Gym. And I told him what I was doing with the Gracies, and they were fascinated. So I had them come over to the academy once, and they watched a bout, and I brought them in on a very interesting first basis because it wasn't a lot of money. It was an awful lot of advertising support, and it was an awful lot of clothing. I wound up with getting a lot of free clothing. So basically, that first event, bringing the two brothers and all of the executives, Derek Barton, head of marketing, all of them came in dressed for Mr. Olympia event. And that first bout with Gerard Gerdou and Taylor Tuli, when he kicked the teeth out of Taylor Tuli's mouth, and Bill Wallace is in a state of shock, all of the Golds people got up, went to the limousines, went back to the hotel, they left the next morning.
No way.
That was the end of the Gold's Gym sponsorship. It was too raw and too bloody for them. And, I had to respect that. And that was the end of Gold's Gym.
Was there a conversation that took place?
Well, I do remember that at one point, Elaine McCarthy had gone up to talk to some of the wives as they were heading out to the limousine, and they were shaking. They were all in these cocktail dresses, and they were all shaking. They said, "We got to leave." So Elaine at one point grabbed a hold of me, and she said, "I think you officially lost all the Ghost people because I saw them get in their limo." The next morning, we were all up and with the fighters and so forth, and we were all getting ready for that big party that we threw that night, that big basketball we threw Saturday night. All the Ghost people had left. They left me some nice messages, and they apologized, but this was not what they expected. They were expecting the kind of evening that you have at Mr. Olympia. Everybody in tuxedos and, in gowns, and there's no fun. Remember that half the fighters in the first UFC went to the hospital.
Wow. It's one of those events, the crowd tends to bring their lunch to work. It's that's a union. Different. That's a union crowd right there, man. That's excellent. Okay, so Mike, they obviously never came back. Go ahead, Chris.
Mike, real quick, I think we've forgot one whole thing here that I think is highly important. The fact that we learned that Art is someone who actually gets Playboy to read the articles. I thought that was a fake thing. He's reading the articles, people. I didn't even know they had articles. That's awesome. Good to hear.
Breaking news.
Sorry, go ahead.
I want to jump in there. Art, thank you very much for all of that. You mentioned Pancrase. You mentioned Jean LaBelle. So obviously you were very in tune and aware of, some of the other maybe sprouts that the sport had. I was wondering, had you run into were you aware of Matt Hume and the UFCF that he had up in the Seattle area? Because they started doing shows like in '92, and Hume was a player later. Who else did you run into there?
Well, I made a point, and I had a Horian's agreement. Horian and I on our partnership. He was taking usher at school and at seminar, and I ran the WOW office, which was about a block and a half away from the academy. And he said to me early on, he said, "Art," he said, "I don't know or care about all these other martial arts." I said, "You know about Pencak Silat?" And Horian said, if I would bring up a martial art like Pencak Silat or Sambo, he would look at me like, "I don't know about him and I don't care about him." So he left it up to me. So early on, I was doing a lot of homework. Who else was out there? That's how I found out about Pancrase. Pancrase came about as a result of a phone call because of an ad I was running in the martial arts magazine for fighters. And Scott Besak from the Lions Den calls me up, and he wants to join the UFC. So as we're talking, he says to me, "Mr. Davie, I don't think I'm really the best guy for this." He said, "I think who you want is my coacher and trainer, Ken Wayne Shamrock." As soon as I heard that name, I said, "I like that name to start with."
Yeah.
Okay. And I began to do some research and found out that in '93, they had launched, and I was doing my homework. I knew about my Hume up in the Seattle area, and I knew about Pancrase. In some cases, it was a work. In some cases, it was a shoot. So when I got Ken Shamrock on the phone, that's the first thing we discussed. He said to me, "Look, if you want me to do a work," he said, "you got to discuss with me what the parameters are." I said, "This is not a work. It's not a work." And the funny story is, he's the last fighter to arrive in Denver because he was doing a Pancrase event in Fukuoka over the weekend. So he doesn't get there till Tuesday morning. Tuesday afternoon, I see him at the hotel lobby, and he says to me, "Mr. D, are you going to give me the straight scoop now? Is this a work or a shoot?" I said, "Ken, I swear to you, we've discussed this already. It's a fucking shoot." He said, I don't believe it until I see it. Now, the night of the event, right after the Rod Gerdou, Taylor Tuli fight, I see him. He's in the dressing area looking up at the monitor, and he looks at the monitor, and he sees me standing about 10 feet behind him. He turns around and he looks at me, and he goes like this to me. Okay. All right.
Excellent.
So that's the story of how, but to answer your question, I was aware that there were guys around the country that were starting to experiment, not you being one of them. And I was aware that the Lou Negli had done some things in Brooklyn. I was trying to put my hands on whatever else there was out there, because I saw that the history of match events was one that nobody had been able to hit a ball out of the park. Nobody. And again, the argument about purse and rules. I knew if I could solve those two problems, my life would be easier. So I selected the 7 fighters other than the other three. Horian came up with Zane Fraser, who was a disciple of Frank Trejos, a well-known karate black belt in LA. And Horian had done some seminars with him. Zane was the International Kickboxing Federation super heavyweight champ. He had also been a bodyguard for Stevie Wonder. I met him at a martial arts trade show after he had a brawl with Frank Dukes.
Okay.
Oh, God.
Hey,
so I came in just right after that when everybody's arguing in the lobby, and Zane comes over to me and says, Mr. D, have you heard about what I just did? I said, well, I'm here to see you. He said, I want to be in the UFC. I got the story from a couple of people, and I reached out with my hand, and I shook Zane's hand, and I said, you're in.
That's good.
Fraser. The other guy, who I think Chris knows, is Jason DeLucia.
Oh, yeah. Bought him.
Had a Tank Abbott match, I think, in late 1999.
Yep.
Right?
Yep. Absolutely. Good.
Can't believe you didn't win that fight, Chris. I don't know what they were judging
by. You know that.
Well, the funny story on Jason was he had come all the way to California to challenge Steven Seagal, based on an article that he read in a magazine where Steven talked about his Aikido skills and that he worked for the CIA at one time. And Jason came all the way out to his office with his resume, and he wanted to fight Steven Seagal. He never got any further than the receptionist. But where does he go next? He goes over to the Gracie Academy. And I get a call from Horian and says, we got a kid over here from the East Coast of Massachusetts, and he wants to roll with either Hoyler, Helson, or Rickson. It was Jason DeLucia. And when I watched him roll, and I actually watched him roll with Hoyler, and I watched him roll, I believe, with Helson for a little while. And I said to him, I'm going to put you in one of the UFCs. And I put him in as the alternate for the first UFC. I eventually lost him to Pancrase, but we've remained friends to this day.
That's good.
I want to toss one more name out at you because you mentioned how Horian kind of banned Gene LeBell. What about the Machados?
Well, the funny story is that after he and Chuck Norris had kind of had a falling out over that fee, he had done some grappling sessions with Gracies, Chuck had. And I heard he even once rolled with Elio. So he had gotten his feet wet there, but when he and Horian fell out, he wound up going over to Horian's cousins, the Machado, and that was the end. And of course, then when he didn't become involved in the UFC, that was the end of. I talked about him in the epilogue to the book. In 2001, I owned a TV show called Spear, in which had been written by Chad and Carrie Hayes, the kids who wrote the movie Saw. And I owned this TV show. It was about a rodeo rider who gets injured and winds up going to LA to look for his brother who gets killed in a drug deal. He's a cop. And he's going to become a bounty hunter with the cop's partner, a girl. And I couldn't get Chuck to agree to a price. I was offering him $500,000 an episode. I had some agreement for some of the studios, and Chuck wanted $750,000. And at one point at his house during that meeting, Chuck raised his hands. He was standing by the fireplace. He said, I want to make an announcement. Well, we're in Chuck Norris's house, so everybody shuts up. We're all sitting there like this. And Chuck looks over and points at me. He says, Art Davie, he said, I want to apologize. He said, 10, 11 years ago, I was wrong about the UFC.
Yeah.
And I thought that's a lot.
Okay, so Art,
first off, real quick, Art, I would do that show for $250,000 episode right now. Just throwing that out there.
So Art, like I'm a promoter from the Midwest. All of us obviously are in the fight game in one capacity or another. And when you have an event, it's really important to kind of start it hot, like put a real solid fight to start so the crowd kind of understands, hey man, this is why we're here. And it sets the momentum for the rest of the locker room. When Gerard, Gerdou and Tuli fought, was that your impression of was that your idea of putting that fight first, or was it just by luck?
Well, Mike, I talk about that in the book because I was charged with doing the matchmaking for the UFC 1. And I literally didn't decide Wednesday night there in the hotel. And Thursday was the press conference of what the matchups were going to be. Here's what I knew, Mike, and see if you understand and agree with this as a promoter. I didn't want to end up with two grapplers at the end. I wanted to get the best striker up against the best grappler. Now, one of the people that I had working with me was the late Zane Bresloff, working with concert promoter Barry Fay in Denver. to help me sell tickets to the live event. And Breslov knew wrestling. And when I met with him and Barry Fay, who was known as the Rock Father, one of the great concert promoters in American history, Barry said to me, he said, well, who do you think is going to win this? I said, I'm not sure. And Zane Breslov said, it's either going to be Ken Shamrock or Royce Gracie. I said, how did you know that? He said, I know wrestling. So I had to figure out what I had to do. And get back to your question, Mike. I had to figure out, I got to get the best grappler up against the best striker. I felt the best striker was Gerdou.
Oh, for sure.
Gerdou from the Maguro gym in Amsterdam, Don Plas, who later died in prison. I called him up, and I called up Tom Herring at the Maguro gym and the Chakariki gym. Both gyms I had on the phone within hours of each other. And I'm trying to get, Peter Arts. I'm trying to get Ernesto Hoost. I'm trying to get the best kickboxer I can get with the budget I had. And Jan Plas said to me, he said, what I want to give you? He said, and there's going to be no special fee for Gerdou. He said, if you own a brothel or if you own a rave here in Amsterdam, or if somebody owes you money and you want to collect it, you know who you hire? Gerard Gerdou. He said, he's the baddest man. He said, he's the real deal. He had been the Savate champion in France. He was half Dutch and half German. His mother was Jewish. And of course, in that first UFC, when he saluted the four corners of the Octagon.
That's my next question.
Yeah, everyone was thinking that it was the fascist salute. So the people at BMG, Bertelsmann's music group, was actually funding Semaphore Entertainment, my partner, one of the biggest entertainment companies, privately held companies on the planet. And they're all Jewish. And they called Bob Marowitz up and they said, "Isn't Art Jewish? How come he hired a Nazi the first event?" They thought Gerdou was a Nazi. But Bob says, no, Art's Sicilian. So Art grew up in a Jewish neighborhood. So that's the story of how I ended up with, I knew I had to get the two, and I knew that Gerdou could beat, I knew he could beat Art Jimison. And I had brought him in, who was at the time ranked 10th in the world by Ring Magazine, both as a cruiserweight and 12th as a heavyweight. I knew he could beat Kevin Rozier. And I knew he could beat Zane Fraser. So I had to get those two guys at the end. And I knew that if I matched up Royce early on that Royce would probably prevail because Shamrock wouldn't be prepared for some of the Gracie jiu-jitsu. And I'll tell you how I knew that. At one point, Orion had shown me a video in his library, and it was Rickson in Salt Lake City rolling on the mat with Mark Schultz, Olympic gold medalist, and the wrestling coach over at the college right there in Salt Lake City, Brigham Young. Okay. It took Rickson 20 minutes to get his arm. When I saw that, and Horian looked at my face, he said, don't get these wrestlers. He said, we can get those guys all the time. So by UFC 4, I brought in Severn to Tulsa.
Yeah.
Okay.
So early on, Horian knew, even though it was all my decision who I was bringing in, he saw the handwriting on the wall that I wanted to bring in Karelyan from Russia. I had talked to the Kowalski brothers.
Wow.
And I said to the Kowalski brothers, what's it going to take for me to get Karelyan to the US of A? They put me on the phone with people in Moscow, and they laughed at me. They laughed at me the way the sumo guys laughed at me about trying to get a sumo wrestler in. They said, you don't have enough money. It would cost you more to get Tyson out of prison than it would cost to get to the US of A.
Wow. So we had talked about like the famous controversy of UFC 1, and you know what? That like white power stigma never left Gerdou. Like it's never left him. Like you can still see articles online. How hard was that fire to extinguish?
Well, I got to tell you, it was in a way. And in all fairness, I talked about this once when we did a podcast with one of the guys from the UFC who handled marketing. And he pointed out that when we brought the wrestlers in to the Olympic gold medalists, Kevin Jackson, Mark Schultz, that suddenly the affiliates, the cable affiliates, started to think, maybe this isn't such a blue-collar skinhead thing. Because you're right, Mike, that early on, I think that the Gerdou salute left an impression in certain people's minds. Now, the good story is that Gerdou's mother is Jewish, and every year he would call me and ask me to pick up some Harley parts for him over at the Harley Davidson in Victorville, California, and ship them to Holland. He was a big biker. And he had iron crosses, but no swastikas on. The last time I saw Gerdou at Cornell University 3 years ago, he had them surgically removed, and now he had front and back a Yakuza bodysuit. I said, Gerard, do you have permission to wear that? He said, Arturo, you know I have a lot of contacts in Osaka.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So when you got European fighters, it seems like there's a high concentration of Dutch fighters. You know, Remco Pardo, Orlando Veit. And then if you think about it, when you were looking at events in Japan, they had Dick Vrij and there were a lot, and they all had that reputation of being bad boys, like, you know,
yes.
like collectors, you know. Like,
well, early on, Miguel, I knew that I could look anywhere and everywhere for fighters. And in the beginning, it was harder because you had to get brave guys willing to put the reputation on the line. After that first show, people seeing that $50,000 check with my signature on it, then my phone started to ring. But early on, I realized there were certain countries like Germany and France that were probably not going to be easy for me to recruit out of. Holland was an absolute bee's nest. Holland was a bee's nest between the Chakariti gym and the Maguro gym. I could always rely on getting good people, and they became friends with me. They would call me up and they would say, Arturo, we got somebody for you. That's how I got Orlando Veit. That's how I got Remco, who was a judoka. So Holland was an enormous plus for me. I'll tell you what was tough early on, because I called and tried to get sumo, was Japan. And I was taking a Japanese conversational course over at the local community college. So I knew just enough to say my name in Japanese. Takushiwa, Nanama Ewa, Davie Des. I would get some guy on the phone. He would say to me, Davie-san. It always be DAP, Davie-san. Davie-san, let me tell you, sumo is the national sport in Japan. No ever way we could send sumo wrestler to America to fight in my blue-collar event, like attitude. Now, I got lucky that I found the American Amateur Sumo Association, Don Fox. And he said to me, I got a guy who was thrown out of sumo in Japan for pushing a reporter through a plate glass window. He's from Hawaii, Samoan. He said, but he's been thrown out of sumo. He's never been to America. He's never seen snow. And I fell in love with him. Remember, there was only 2 fighters that got a bonus for showing up, and it wasn't any of the Gracies. It was the boxer, Art Jimmerson. 10th in the world, and I had to give $6,000 to Taylor Tuli. And when I met him at the airport, I had an envelope with 6 $1,000 bills in my suit. When we first came up, and he's 420 pounds, 6'2", and he looks at me, and I started to try to talk to him. I could tell he was like, "Is this the guy?" You know, I'm this big. He finally throws his arm around me, and he says, "I come to America because of you." I reached in my pocket, I took out the envelope, and I opened it up. I said, "This is you." So that's the story of how I got those 2 fighters. But remember that Royce was the last fighter I signed. The last fighter for UFC 1. Also, saying to Horion, who are we going to put in for Gracie Jiu-Jitsu? He said, Arturo, don't rush me. Don't push. I will tell you. He says to me. Well, he had a falling out with Rickson. Rickson had taken some of the students and were teaching them over his garage from the school.
Oh, so he was teaching personals.
Teaching personals. Horion found it out twice. Well, that soured Horion on Rickson. He didn't want to put Helson in. He said Helson is a great street fighter, but he didn't want to put Helson in. He's the one who finally said to me in August, it's going to be Royce. He said, Royce, does he have a driver's license? He said, he's the guy who speaks up to the academy every day. And he lived in the garage at Horion's house in a tiny apartment, and his roommate was a fish tank with 2 piranhas.
Okay.
So I said to him, I said, Royce is just a kid. He babysits your kids. Horion says, Arturo, you've seen us in the back room of the school rolling with people. Have we ever lost? I said, no, but now I said, I'm going to bring in some really great guys. He said, that's your job. He said, keep doing it. And
you got to respect that.
Real quick, I mean, the word on the street I always heard was the reason they put Royce in first was because Rickson looked the part. He was a great fighter, and Royce was the best. And, the other brothers like looked more like fighters. That's why they threw Royce, and it was like a publicity thing. But that's not true, is it? It was just he had a falling out with Rickson. Is that what?
Chris, that's been going around a lot. And I think, in all fairness, I got to give him credit. He's the one who likes to tell the story that it was because it, looked like Bruce Lee. He looked like the 98-pound weakling. Remember that Royce only weighed 175 pounds soaking wet. He was a welterweight. So Rorion likes to tell that story, but I know the politics, and I know that the only thing that Rorion was going to do was that he allowed Rickson to train Royce. So in the first 2 UFCs, you see Rickson in Royce's corner, and I used to tell a story, personal friends, that's Rickson's spine in Royce's back. Because in UFC 3, when he ran out of gas against Chemo, and he didn't have Rickson in the corner, he didn't have Rickson there. That's when he ran out of gas emotionally. I was so excited for him on UFC 4 in Tulsa because he beat Dan Severn on his own in an 18-minute where he finally catches him. So he did it on his own without Rickson there.
Yeah. What was the reason for Rickson no longer cornering Royce? That's actually one of my questions.
That's a very good question. After UFC 3, I get a phone call from Rorion over at the academy. He says, the old man is in town. He met Elio. Yeah. I always wanted to see Elio. He was fascinating to me. So Rorion says, we want to have a meeting at the WOW office on Saturday. I said, well, with who? He said, me, the old man, Royce, and Rickson. I said, it's done, whatever you need. He said, I'll tell you tonight. He said, but I have a plan. He had already talked to Royce. He had gotten Royce to step down. Royce was going to voluntarily leave the UFC after UFC 3. They all came over to the office Saturday morning. I had a big blue table, which was acted as my desk. I'm sitting behind the desk. Rickson is on my left. Rorion is seated right next to him. And on the couch is Elio Gracie, and sitting next to his father is Royce, sitting there with his head down, not saying a word. Rorion had already put it straight with him. You're not going to be in. We're going to let your brother come in. And at that point, I had the fish tank, and it had been in Royce's apartment with the piranhas. So he's sitting next to the fish tank with the piranhas, with his head down, and Rickson comes in. And Rickson comes in and sits down, and he bows to his father, and he nods to Rorion, and we get talking. And Rickson says to me, he said, I understand that Rorion has talked to Royce, and you would be interested in my coming in. I said, yes, absolutely. He said, I want $1 million. I said, Rickson, nobody's getting $1 million. You don't have $1 million. They're getting $60,000, $70,000. He said, I want $1 million. At that point, Rorion, who had not said a word, the old man raises his hand and stands up. And in Portuguese, he says something to Rickson. I later got Rorion to translate it. Here's what the old man said to Rickson. When I was your age, we did jiu-jitsu not for the money. We did it for the honor of Gracie's jiu-jitsu.
Wow.
Doesn't say another word. He sits down. Rickson stood up, nodded at his father respectfully, didn't even look at Rorion, shook hands with me, didn't even look at Royce, and left. And that's the last time I had a discussion with Rickson Gracie about the UFC story.
Wow.
Wow, that's amazing.
Wow.
Now, I have a little bit of a Gracie question. Going back to UFC 1, I wanted to know, how did you decide on a 3-hour pay-per-view slot? Because you had no time limits, and then you had to have Rorion telling you about Helio's 3-hour fight in Japan and blah, blah, blah. So how'd you get down to that time?
Miguel, that's a very interesting question. I think that a lot of fans can understand and appreciate it. Here's why. Pay-per-view traditionally was a 2 or 3 hour window slot. And when I say pay-per-view, you're talking about HBO, Showtime, et cetera, And Superfoot Entertainment Group that I found in the library, they were doing concerts and comedy on pay-per-view. They would do the farewell tour for the Judds, Naomi and Winona. The heavyweight champion of comedy, Andrew Dice Clay. They didn't have a franchise. So when I called them up, they were looking at midget wrestling. They were trying to think of a franchise idea. They didn't have one. Well, I sent them the Gracie in action tape and a page executive summary. They called me up and they sent me tickets to New York. And they told me, we could do this in 3 hours. can you get this done in 3 hours? Well, when I got back to California, Miguel, I said to Horion, didn't your father get involved in a match that went on for forever that's historically famous? He said, yes. He said, but you got to remember, you've been in the back room when we've taken down guys from black belts at karate, taekwondo, you know. He said, believe me, none of these people are going to last more than 5 or 8 minutes, ever. He said, you're not going to have to worry about that. Remember, though, that we did run over in Tulsa. And later, the Fertitas ran over, I think was a UFC 30. They ran over. So the idea of trying to make this fit, a very good question, Miguel. Pay-per-view was telling me, look, we think this is a 3-hour deal. Well, you know, we think it's 3 hours of entertainment. And believe me, you've got 8 matches, and if we have time, we'll show the 2 alternates. But you know, I've got to give them enough, and I've got to give them enough time between matches to build up, because like Mike said, you want to build the heat for these fighters. And we were doing a little education on every style. You know, this is Sambo, this is Draka, this is Hang Sudo. We were trying to educate the audience. Remember, nobody in America, other than the movies and the video games, had ever thought about doing a real Kumite. We were doing it for real. For me, it was such a wild, wonderful time because I was making this stuff up as I was going along. I was inventing this stuff as I was doing it.
So now, you know, we had kind of talked about earlier in regards to the referees for the first event.
Yes.
All right. How does that conversation take place? Because, you know, this Gracie Jiu-Jitsu is something, you know, very new, as well as bringing these people in from Brazil. That locker room, you know, was probably pretty catty in regards to why they shouldn't do it to begin with.
Yes.
And now you got 2 referees from Brazil, handpicked by Horion with Grace in there, with Royce in there. So how does that conversation be how do you appease the locker room with that situation?
Mike, let me address that, because that really is also the key issue behind the fighters meeting on Thursday night, which blew up, and I talk about in the book. We had lost control of that meeting because Horion was going to go over what the rules were. There really were no rules, but Horion did not want the knuckles to be wrapped. You could have hand wraps, but you couldn't wrap the knuckles. Well, Zane Fraser says, as the kickboxing fighter champion, I wrap my knuckles all the time. And Art Jimison says, in 7 weeks, I'm due to fight Tommy Hitman Hearns, boxing Hall of Famer. And believe me, my knuckles are wrapped. He said, I can't go in there without wrapped knuckles. So the meeting blows up. The meeting blows up. At one point, I see Rickson stand up. And Fraser was standing and arguing with Horion. And there's a picture of me in the book where my hands are like this at the table. I'm lost at this point because I don't know how to save this thing. Who saves my ass is Taylor Tuli. I had passed out a sheet about what everybody was going to be. It was basically pancreas rules. No biting, no eye gouging. And we were asking everybody to sign a release. The back of the room with his 2 brothers and his cousin, Taylor Tuli stands up. And everybody gets quiet because 420 pounds, he stands up, he raises his hands, he says, I want to say something. Everybody shuts up, including Zane. Rickson sits down. I thought, thank God, because I thought we were heading to a brawl. If I'm going to have everybody in the police station, there's no fight tomorrow night. So Taylor says, I don't know about the rest of you guys, but I'm ready to sign this. And whoever wants to party tomorrow night, I'll see you in the arena. Everyone started stopping, including the Gracies. That was the end of Horion sat down. It was the end of it. We all left the room. I grabbed him and gave him a big hug. He saved my ass. I figured that if this thing cuts into a brawl, if Zane Fraser and Rickson get it on, all these guys are going to be, the cops will be here. We'll be in jail. I'll be in jail. We're all gone. That's how that thing got saved. By the way, though, here's the funny story on the 2 referees, Mike. When I did the book, I actually had to do some research. And I found out that Elio Vigio had one time been the chief of police in Rio de Janeiro.
Okay.
But he had also, and I found this from a book in the Dallas the University of Texas Library, he had also been head of one of the death squads in Brazil when the military took over from the leftist Django Goulart.
Ooh.
This is well. Elio Vigio had been a black belt jiu-jitsu guy doing some Valley Judo fights when he was a teenager when he was 20. But now I know him, he's in his 40s. Former police chief in Rio de Janeiro. And in 1964, there was a book in the Dallas branch of the University of Texas Library that talked about the fact that there were a lot of people who felt that he had been involved in some very, maybe even, interrogations.
Oh, for sure.
Okay. So that was who Elio Vigio was. The funny story on Joao Barreto, he had been a Vale Tudo fighter, but he had started, you talk about Matt Hughes up in the Seattle area. In Brazil, Elio Vigio was no longer fighting, he was a cop. Joao Barreto was involved with something called Luta Livre Americana. What was that? That was a cross between, it was a little bit of Muay Thai and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, when he was attempting to create some sort of a pancrase type event.
It's more of a catch wrestling style.
Exactly. Thank you. With catch can wrestling. So I wound up with two referees who Poirier had never completely explained to me enough background on these guys. So Mike, you bring up a very good point. When we were at the fighter meeting, one of the things that Zane Fraser says is, well, Poirier Gracie is one of the promoters. His brother's in the event. And now we've got two Brazilian referees. He was in effect waving his hand and saying, is this a real deal?
Well, I think one of the surprising things is you've got a guy from, a Gracie faction of jiu-jitsu, and you got a Luta Livre guy, which, at that point, in theory, they're supposed to be at war with one another.
Yes.
And they're together. We got Joe Hill de Oliveira coming on later on this week. And those are some of the questions we're going to ask him. Like, we've got these lined up. Like, we're getting super dorky with this stuff, and that's absolutely going to get brought up.
Well, if anything, I had an issue afterwards with Horian about this. I said, Horian, don't have a blindside me. He says, these are my cattle. I know them better than you do. I said, but you got to tell me who they are, what they are, and why they are. Now, in all fairness, after the first show, I wrote a memo to New York, and I recommended a couple of things. I said, number one, no more Brazilian referees. And my New York TV partners at Semaphore agreed. So now I'm over at the Academy one night after being the WoW officer. I said to Horian, let's talk about a referee. He said, I got an idea. I figured, don't bring up another Brazilian. He said, no. He said, what about John McCarthy?
Big
Now,
John.
I was John McCarthy because we were both blue belts in the Academy.
Was he at the first event?
He was in the first event, and I got to tell you the funny story. All week long, Horian had paid for an additional room on his own for the hotel, not paid for by WOW or Semaphore or anybody, so that they could work out. They brought some mats up, and McCarthy was there as a big fighter along with Royce. Knowing that I had Evan Rozier, who told me he weighed 265, and he weighed 315, and Taylor Wiley, who weighed 420. So they had McCarthy there weighing 485. And Royce was in that room. I never saw him the whole week. I didn't see Royce until the trainer meeting on Thursday. They kept Royce hidden from me the whole week. Isn't that interesting?
Wow, that is. So Big John McCarthy was there. He kind of, makes his way to the forefront in regards to refereeing. And another one of the things that has always interested us is Bill Superfoot Wallace and Jim Brown. Okay. Were there other people that were asked to do commentary prior to them, and why did you guys choose them?
Well, I had chosen Wallace and Kathy Long, the Queen of Mean. They had been having a running argument in Black Belt magazine about whether or not it was appropriate for women to be in combat sports. And of course, Kathy Long was in favor of it. And Bill Wallace thought that it was, he was taking the chauvinist position, I guess, it's inappropriate. So I figured that would be a colorful team, maybe a play-by-play.
Sounds like an argument.
Yeah. So, and Semaphore bought into it. On the other hand, Semaphore calls me up and said, what about Jim Brown doing color? I said, Jim Brown, from the Cleveland Browns, the Hall of Famer? I said, my God, that I would love that. But the funny story is, when Jim gets into Denver, 2 or 3 days before the event, we're all up in my conference room in the hotel, the Executive Tower Inn. And this was about 7:30. We're all kind of relaxing. And Jim Brown was there. I pour him a cup of coffee. Bill Wallace comes in. And Wallace starts to do what he would do if he was in this event. He stands up and he starts to do some Superfoot kicks. And who's sitting on the couch next to me? My left is Horian. And Horian's got his chin in his hand like this. And he's looking over at me, shaking his head. And who's sitting right next to me is Jim Brown. And every once in a while, Jim and I would make eye contact, and I could see in Jim's eyes that he thought that Wallace was full of shit. I found that fascinating. And the funny story is that when we get closer to the event, Bill Wallace tells Semaphore, I'm realizing that I don't have enough knowledge to be able to do play-by-play. He said, I really want to be able to do color. So they wound up convincing Jim Brown to come in to do the color. And then Bill would, with some help from our producers and me, would try to understand the different styles. But Bill, as you saw from the event, he burps when he introduces the name of the show. He calls it the Ultimate Fighting Challenge.
Yeah.
Ultimate Fighting Championship. And he mispronounces everyone's name. Royce Gracie became Royce. Rod Machado became Rod Machado.
Yeah.
His name got mangled. Bill Wallace was totally lost. But I think Bill thought that by Wednesday he was going to be relieved and maybe see a color commentator, and we'd bring somebody else in to do play-by-play. And we couldn't at the last minute. And remember, who was I going to get at the last minute to do play-by-play when you've got all those different styles? It's not a boxing commentator who can do that. Chris would understand that. You have to have some cross-reference to all these different, the funny story is, I always love to tell the story that, who changed MMA with the fighters? After UFC 3, who shows up at the Gracie Academy wanting jiu-jitsu lessons? Timo Leopoldo. And Horion turns him down. He tells him to get lost. He said, why'd you do that? He said, well, he's the enemy. He said, are you stupid? He's paying you a compliment. He wants to learn what. And he was one of the first fighters who started to realize if you're a grappler, you needed to learn striking. If you were striking, you needed to learn grappling. Yeah. It started then, and it kept going.
So let's talk about the fighter contract. So the fighter contract today is like maybe 50, 60 pages. Like it's bonkers. Yeah. Did you guys use like a blueprint from like the boxing standpoint, or did you guys come up with your own contract?
I wrote the first contract.
Oh my gosh. Are you kidding me?
And I ran it by Mark Trados, who's a great entertainment lawyer here in Vegas. Now he represents the MGM, among others. And he looked over my shoulder from a legal standpoint. But I'm the guy who put in there how the fight could end, including my death. So I wrote the first contract. And the funny story is when we were doing UFC 12 and we had to fly all the fighters from upstate New York down to Dothan, Alabama, because we had been banned at the last minute in New York State.
Yeah. I got that question. We're going to get there. We're going to get there.
We're on the plane, and I'm sitting up in the front like I'm a big shot, right, in first class. But who's behind me a couple of rows is Ken Shamrock. And he's joking with everybody. He says, let me tell you a story. He says, when I first joined the UFC, he holds up a postage stamp and says, this was the size of the UFC contract. He holds up a phone book. He says, now this is the size of the UFC. But it's true. It kept growing. By the time that I was on in January of 1998, believe me, those agreements now were being handled by Semaphore's lawyers in New York.
What was the total cost of the contract legally when you were with the UFC?
What do you mean in terms of the fighter purse?
No. How much did that contract cost legally to come up with?
Oh, I wrote it for nothing. And Mark Trados looked it over my shoulder as a favor.
But how about like towards the end, like before you left?
No, toward the end, well, the legal fees. I remember on one show for Charlotte, our legal fees were for civil to protect us against the civil opposition, not even the criminal, was $50,000.
Oh my God.
Oh yeah. So I got to tell you a funny story. What do you think the Octagon, the first Octagon cost?
I got that as well as the change. Let me just. All right. So what was the actual cost of the Octagon, as well as when did you guys scrap it and decide to make changes to it?
Good question. Well, the first thing I recommended when I first came to New York with the in-action tape for the Semaphore people to look at, Bob Myrowitz said to me, "There you go." Bob Myrowitz said to me, "So we're going to do this in a boxing ring, right?" Because as I mentioned in the book, Bob once told me the story that he could have been the first Jewish heavyweight boxing champion. And I thought, what? He forgot about Max Baer? What are you talking about, Bob? But in any event, Bob says to me, "We're going to do this a boxing ring." So Hori and I had sat down, and Hori and I together wrote a one-page memo, and we sent it to Michael Pilat, who was the line producer for Semaphore. And we said to him, "Here's whatever we do is what it has to have and what it can't have." Horion knew the experience of doing Vale Tudo events in Brazil in a boxing ring. People would roll to the ground and roll out. It would slow down the action. If you're a fighter, you understand that today. In those days, nobody knew. But we had convinced Bob that we needed to have some solution. And in fact, it's in the book. I had a couple of sketches of some screens and some gates and so forth. Bob called me up and said, I've got 2 Hollywood set designers, Jason Cusson and Greg Harrison. They want to submit some sketches. They submitted 5 sketches, and the one we selected is the one you see. The price for the first first Octagon, $28,000.
Ooh, wow.
Now, the funny story, Mike, is the night of the show. After the show is over, I run into Pilot, and he's got all of his grips, and they're tearing the thing down. And Pilot says to me, he says, well, say goodbye to it before I dump it. I said, what do you mean dump it? He said, well, he says, it's a set, right? We're going to do, and you signed a 5-year contract. We're going to do other sets. I said, do you know how much Bob and I paid for that? Michael didn't know. I had been smart enough to rent a U-Haul space. I had the keys. I gave them the Pilot and said, here's the address. Put it in here. So he boxed it up. And after the first couple of UFCs, we wound up designing a new one that was more foldable, like an origami.
Yeah.
And then that one cost even more. A lot more.
Oh my God.
True
So
story.
do you know where the first UFC Octagon is at currently?
No, I don't.
I wonder who's got it.
I remember
that there's an attorney who's got the first ring mat and the first thing that we hung up there in McNichols Arena. Which was a huge, design with that guy with the bald head and the
Bald head, yeah.
UFC logo.
Okay. So the bald head logo.
Yes.
Okay. So my friends and I used to always kind of tease like, oh, a new organization's coming. What bald head logo are they going to have? I mean, and you saw like King of the Cage actually had like a bald head guy like try out in order to open and close their doors. Did you guys have any idea that like for the next 10 years, any single organization coming to the forefront just wouldn't be able to get out of that box? Like they'd have to have some sort of bald guy logo attached to themselves?
Well, how it came about was that the UFC was split 50-50 between Semaphore and WOW Promotions. But for the first event, Horian and I put up $101,000 for the purse, and Semaphore was obligated to pay for the marketing. And that meant whatever marketing, whether it was an article in Penthouse Magazine, whether it was 30-second commercials for the cable, affiliates around the country and around Canada. And they were obligated to pay for the production costs. So the true story is that the day of the show, I found out, because I still hadn't signed the 5-year agreement. And finally, one of the
day of the show,
you have this is November 12th. Yeah. This is Friday around lunchtime. And one of the Semaphore guys said, Bob expects you're going to sign that like yesterday. I said, well, no, that was the press conference. I haven't signed it yet. He said, Bob is not coming to the show. He stayed home in Woodbury, Long Island, didn't come. And the BMG people didn't come to the first show. They came to the second show after they saw Gerard Gerdou, the Nazi. So now it's 1:00, Mike, and I haven't signed the contract. So now I get a call from Bob Marowitz, and I said, Bob, I think I figured out that you can't put this show on tonight unless you have us as your TV partner. He said, well, I can't admit that. I said, well, I know that to be a fact. I later found out that's exactly what happened. That Viewers' Choice and Request wouldn't allow them unless that the promotional partner, us, had signed the agreement. So Bob and I wound up on the phone with our respective attorneys. Bob's still at his house. His brother, David Marowitz, the attorney, and my attorney in Burbank, used to work for Disney, and we're still arguing about it. Finally, I said to Bob, I tell you what, I'll sign right now. But starting in UFC 2, you pick up not only production and marketing, you pick up the purse. And Bob called me names, but he finally agreed, and I signed. But to answer your question, it was a marketing with an advertising agency in New York, and Dan Cloris, the great Dan Cloris, one of the great PR guys, and in fact, that great movie about Emil Griffith and Benny Perrette. Dan Cloris is the director. Dan Cloris worked for Semaphore Entertainment, and one of their artists that they hired came up with the ball guy, who came from the advertising agency business, did not create that.
Nobody could get away from that bald guy no matter what organization.
None.
It was bizarre. It was fist logo, bald guy. you're an MMA organization at that point for at least the next decade. So UFC 1, obviously you got 3-hour time window of pay-per-view. That question Miguel had asked. At UFC 2, which in my opinion is probably the most brutal UFC, it's probably the most brutal in all of combat sports history in regards to live events that exists. So UFC 2 was a 16-man tournament. Now you're still toying with that 3-hour window, and you just doubled the amount of fights that you had. How big of a concern was it? Why the jump from 8 to 16?
Well, my original plan, my original 65-page business plan talked about a 16-minute. We wound up cutting it down to 8 when we got into negotiations with Semaphore, because they knew the pay-per-view business, and I would sit down with them and we would spitball it. You know, if you had these two guys in, how long would they take? Could this be a 15-minute bout? Is this a 5-minute bout? But we all agreed that it would be 8-man. On my own, between UFC 1 and UFC 2, I decided I wanted to do a 16-man tournament, and I began sending faxes to Campbell McLaren, who was the head of acquisitions for Semaphore in New York, and Campbell thought it was a great idea. Now Campbell gets to Denver for UFC 2, and he finally realizes when he gets to the hotel that it's 16-man, and now Michael Pilat, our producer, is there, and he's saying, Bob, you need to be here today. You know, don't wait for another day to get here to Denver. Davie's running a 16-man tournament. He's got some guy from Spain, Alberto Cerro Leon, who's going to fight the judo guy, Renko Pardue, and Davie is convinced we can get the 16-man in the 3-hour window, and we did. Now the true story is though that Campbell lost his bonus that year. Campbell lost his bonus that year. He was supposed to get a bonus at Christmas time, Christmas, Hanukkah, and Bob was so furious at him. He said, "You let Art rodeo you," and I said, "I got all the emails to prove it." Campbell agreed, and he did, but he never told Bob, and he never told Michael Pilat, our line producer, who get into Denver and go, "Holy shit, we got 16 men in this tournament."
And you barely made that one. You barely made it, but.
And by the way, some of those fights were unbelievable.
Brutal. Unbelievably brutal. Unbelievably brutal. So there's a little bit of controversy on our side, like the nerd side that, you know, no one in their right mind would even have these conversations about. So UFC 2, first off, before we get to that, Fred Edish explained to us you guys lost the venue at the last minute. Is that true?
No. The true story is that you're talking about UFC 2?
Yes.
Yes. UFC 2, we couldn't get back into McNichols Arena. At that point, we were starting to get some opposition from the Denver mayor. Early on, politicians and the media decided that this was human cockfighting. That didn't happen with Brian Gumbel or Senator John McCain. It really started even with the Denver mayor. So we had the event, and that event was held in kind of a rough part of town, but it was a 2,000-seat arena. I knew we'd standing room only, and that's what happened. On the other event, the only place I could put the fighters, there wasn't enough room inside the event for dressing rooms. So in the hotel and the motel, which was right next to the event, I took that over, and there were prostitutes going in and out, and that's what Fred Edish remembers. There was wall-to-wall prostitutes, and that was the UFC 2. That was where we held the event, but we had no chance of getting McNichols Arena, and for some reason right now I can't think of the name of the event. Mike, you might remember it.
You know what the name of the venue?
Yeah, the name of the venue.
Oh, I wish I knew.
I forget.
All right, so
the true story is that Edish didn't know that he was going to be an alternate, and I had to go out and find him in the parking lot.
Yes. Did you find him or did Horian find him?
No, I found him.
Okay.
I think Horian told me where he was, and I went out and grabbed a hold of him and said, go put your gi back on. You're fighting.
Right. So in essence, let me frame that a little bit better for everybody at home. So in essence, you guys had 16 fights. You have 2 alternates.
Right.
But there was no alternate fights. Like the alternates were just there. So you guys didn't kind of put into the equation if somebody won their fight and got injured in a win and could not continue, which you guys find Fred Edish and pull him in there, which I mean, I'm going to be honest with you.
Edish was there as an alternate. He was one of the three alternates. But Mike, you bring up a really good point. And I think any nerds out there, if they put their thinking cap on the team, what would they think? What would they be thinking? Because if I had any significant injuries, would I have run out of alternates? And then how does the thing continue? But, a lot of what I was doing was based on what we had done in UFC 1. Remember, 3 guys went to the hospital, but they were all that night in the bar having drinks with me. Before the night was over. Remember that Kevin Rozier on Wednesday had a crown done or a root canal on Wednesday. The night of the event, he hits his head on the lighting on the way into the Octagon. And then he gets in there and he winds up getting kneed in the balls by Zane Fraser. He winds up outlasting Fraser and knocking him out. Then he has to get in the ring with Gerard Gerdou, who he worshipped. He didn't want to win. He was so thrilled that he could be in the same ring as Gerard Gerdou. But he was able to get, and I love Kevin. I loved Kevin. He used to call me Pop. He used to call me Pop Davie. And then the night of the party, he went and challenged John McCarthy to a pizza eating contest. So, I was basing a lot of what I was doing as I was going along with, look at what we did with UFC 1. 3 guys went to the hospital, but, they were ready to fight that night or the next morning. So I was guessing about a lot of stuff. Could I have been very wrong? Well, remember.
That was a good move, though. That was a good move.
In Tulsa, we wound up running over. And believe me, that was expensive because now you got a lot of affiliates said we didn't see the final.
Yeah. Okay, so UFC 2. Let's kind of read. To me, this event is historically. I mean, obviously, UFC 1 is the most important MMA event, in terms of the sport. Number 2, UFC 2. There should almost be like an instructional on just how brutal and barbaric it was, and there had to have been a lot of bodies piling up. And one of the and I've watched this UFC 2 like literally frame by frame, and it appears to me from somebody with a trained eye that about halfway through the event, you guys had somebody assigned to walk around the outside, and Big John McCarthy kind of look at him and they'd throw the towel in. Is that true, or am I off?
I think that's more of an assumption. I that's not my memory of it.
Okay.
Again, we were running, in all fairness, we were all making this up as we went along. We were on virgin ground doing this.
How many ambulances did you guys have for UFC 2?
I had 2 for the first UFC, and we ran out. Kathy was calling the police, and she was calling cab companies. We ran. Now for UFC 2, I had 6 ambulances.
And you guys probably went through them because, Chris, you see these fights and you're yelling at the TV, "Do something, Big John! Stop these fights!" And it was, it was pretty brutal.
Mike, here's a good point. For UFC 2, the people from Bertelsmann's music group came to America, and I remember them in the truck. And I remember them when Pat Smith was mounted on Scott Morris and was hitting him with elbows, and the cuts and the blood was flying. And I looked over at guys from BMG, and they were white as ghosts. Their eyes were this big. One guy had his hands in front of his face. They were in a state of shock.
Well, was that the first crazy knockout that night? Was it Morris, Pat Smith? Was that the first crazy knockout that night?
Yes. And you got to remember that I was eager to get. There were 3 guys that were unhappy with the first UFC at the party the night after the UFC. They were the 3 were. Ken Shamrock, he had lost to Royce. Pat Smith had lost to Ken Shamrock. And seated behind me at a table, yelling at each other in Portuguese, were Gracie and his wife, Kim. And Brazilians who were there translated for me later and said, Kim was yelling at him and telling him that his brother had rodeoed him and had cheated him out of the opportunity to become the Ultimate Fighter by putting Royce in. He was very difficult. But I had put, Pat Smith was the first fighter I signed in UFC 1. I went up to Tiger Kim's gym on Colfax, and I had watched him work out. And Bobby Lewis down in Las Vegas had been using him on 4- and 6-round boxing matches. And I figured if I can get a local guy who could punch and get him into the finals, yeah, I'm in. You know, I'm thinking like you, man, like a promoter, right?
Yeah, for sure.
UFC 2, well, guess what I ended up with?
Him in the finals, baby.
Yes, I got Pat Smith and Royce Gracie. Beautiful.
Was Pat Smith a big ticket seller? I mean, he's from that area.
Well, he helped me locally to get to. Okay. He was always difficult to work with. I like Pat. Pat liked me. He once told me that you're one of the few white guys I've ever trusted. I think that was great.
Wow, was he wrong? Wow, was he wrong?
Hey, yeah. let me ask you: Didn't Pat get into a brawl with Tank Abbott at one of the?
Now UFC. Now that I'll tell you that in 10 seconds. He didn't want to fight Abbott in the Octagon, and he made sure that he was injured. He was telling the doctor, but we couldn't put him forward. The next day, I'm having breakfast in the hotel coffee shop with John McCarthy, and I'm there with John, the guy who lost his penis to his wife.
John Wayne Bobbitt.
John Wayne Bobbitt. I'm having breakfast
I remember
with
that,
John
Chris.
McCarthy.
You both did.
The coffee shop down to the elevators, and there's Maurice Smith, who later was UFC Hall of Fame, running down to the elevator. Who's done at the elevator is Tank Abbott. He's there with Tito Ortiz. He's there with Paul
Herrera. Paul
Herrera and the
Tiki Goshen.
And they had mugged Pat Smith in the elevator. By the time that I got there, Maurice Smith was cradling him in his hands. He was bleeding all from his mouth. They had jumped him in the elevator and got him on the ground and kicked the shit out of him. And as I watched going toward the other elevators, who was there with Tito and Tank waving at me. Bye, Art. True story. I stayed in Denver. I stayed in Casper with Pat Smith till Monday afternoon because they did 16 stitches inside of his mouth. I stayed there with the company credit card and was the last person to take him over to the airport.
Wow. Okay, so Oleg Taktarov, we had him on a few months ago, and he claims he shows up over at the Gracie gym. He does the Gracie challenge, does fantastic with it. Horion is asking him for $30 a month. He gets insulted. He leaves, but he says that Horion leaves the gym to go talk to you at your office. He's for sure. They're saying very good things about him, but he couldn't get into the UFC. And it turns out that they were bad-mouthing him and forcing your hand not to use him in the earlier tournaments. How true is that?
Mike, that's a very good one, too. But here's the true story. And Oleg, I think, has told several versions of it. But I know Oleg and love him. And
I like all of his versions, just for the record.
I've heard all of them. Well, let me tell you what actually happened. I come in every day in the morning at 9 o'clock. And one morning I come in, and who's sitting in my doorstep is Oleg Taktarov, just sitting there in the doorstep. And
that's scary.
And Oleg didn't speak any English at the time. Now, what I did have going for me is my brother-in-law, Alex Ayosha Mitkovich, was a police officer in Carlsbad, California, been married to my sister. And I called Alex up and I said, Alex, I need you to translate for me. He's got a video, and I'm going to put it up on the screen and look at it, but he doesn't speak any English. So I put my brother-in-law on, and my brother-in-law and Alex and Oleg are talking. And Oleg is asking my brother-in-law, he said, how could Arthur be related to you? Arthur's not Russian, doesn't speak any Russian, and you speak fluent Russian. So my brother-in-law is trying to tell him, look, he's my brother-in-law, and I'm trying to explain to him who you are. So Oleg tells him, he says, tell him that I trained Spetsnaz, Special Forces troop in Russia. I fought bare knuckle. Look at video. I want to be in UFC. I thanked my brother-in-law, and I said to Oleg, just sit down. I called up Horion, and I said, Horion, I'm going to send somebody over to the academy. It was within 75 yards of the office. I sent Oleg over there. Horion had him roll with a brown belt, Lloyd. And Lloyd's brother was the guy who did our T-shirts in Denver. And
okay.
3 hours go by, and I don't hear anything. I called up the academy. I said, hey, what happened to that guy I sent over? Or he said, we looked at him. He said, nothing. He said, I let him go. I said, what do you mean? I said, I'm going to put this guy in. He said, you have to remember something. He said, my father always talked about suburban techniques, leg locks, foot locks. We don't think much of those. He blew him out. So I called Oleg up, got my brother-in-law on the phone again, and before you know it, I had him in UFC 6. I put him in UFC 5 first. You remember UFC 5, where he lost, I believe, to Severn.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, yeah, but I never gave up on Oleg. Horian, I don't know about the $30 if Horian actually asked him to pay for lessons. That I don't suspect. It doesn't sound like Horian. Horian, if they were real competition, Horian wouldn't have anything to do with it. Remember, he turned down Kimo Leopoldo after UFC 3. So I can't Horian saying to him after we saw him roll, and if I know Oleg, he probably tried to get Lloyd to an ankle lock. Once Horian saw that,
Done.
You got to remember, Horian tried to tell me that Mark Schultz was nobody after I watched that video for 20 minutes, and it took how long to get his arm. Oh, you know, those Olympic guys, you know, you can't look at those guys are full of shit for you.
So there is a little bit of truth to Oleg stating that Horian was trying to keep him out of the UFC.
Oh, absolutely. That part of it's true, Mike. Because when I called over there, I said, what happened? Horian said, I blew the guy out. Really? I'm thinking, what are you talking about? I looked at the video. I brought the video over to Horian. Horian said, well, you know, that's a foreign country. Who knows what they do over there?
Okay. All right. So you're an East Coast guy, and you're a California transplant.
Yes.
So we had Rob Kahn on, one of the first interviews we've done. He's one of Royce's, first black belts. We said, first 15 black belts that Royce did. So that East Coast perspective on the Gracie family is a different set of eyes that most people don't get to see through. So like the East Coast perspective in regards to the whole Gracie clan, even on the respectful side, is just a little bit different than the Californians and how, they present the information. So in your opinion, why does Rickson not fight Goker? Why does Rickson not fight Sakuraba? Especially Sakuraba, where Japan had the money. It was set up. I mean, Sakuraba was going through all the Gracies. It was right there and the money was available. So let's start with Goker. And if you could please move to Sakuraba. And this is obviously just an opinion on your end.
I was a big fan of Gokor Chavikians. I knew who he was. I always tried to get him in the UFC. He'll tell you that. I was a big fan of Gokor's. And, this was it. Remember, after UFC 5, I knew that the Gracies weren't coming back. Because I asked Horian, I says, I'm booking the show in Casper. Can I count on Royce? And Horian wouldn't give me an answer. That was one of my reasons for making the decision that I did to sell our 50% share from WOW Promotions to Semaphore. I talk about that in the book. So I also wrote about that time an article for Todd Hester's Gladiator or Grappling Mag. I think it was Gladiator magazine, in which I compared Rickson to bodybuilding Sergio Oliva. He was the great Mr. Olympia before Arnold. And then when Arnold showed up, Sergio Oliva made sure he never competed mano a mano against Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I compared Rickson to Sergio Oliva. I think when Rickson saw that I was bringing in Mark Coleman, Randy Couture, Don Fry, right?
Fry was a savage. Fry was a savage back in the day.
And Kazushi Sakuraba. Rickson decided it was easier to go over to Japan and play with wrestlers. You got to remember the guy who really made Rickson's career was Royce's comments following UFC 1 to Japanese journalists. They kept saying, "You're great." He said, No. He said, "I am nothing." He said, "If you want to see great, you should see Rickson." So they began to think, wow, the guy who wins the UFC says that I'm the real guy in the family. Rickson asked me for $1 million, but you're right. He went over and was happy to play with professional wrestlers in Japan. Oko Tavikian, the Gracie killer, Kazushi Sakuraba, who's also in the Hall of Fame. The irony is that Rickson Gracie never wanted to be in the UFC. And remember, the story that I tell about that meeting on Saturday at the WOW office, and his father saying to him, "I didn't do jiu-jitsu for the money. I did it for the honor of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu." Rickson didn't say a word. He left. That was the last time I ever discussed anything with Rickson Gracie. Rickson decided that money was in Japan, and he didn't have to work as hard for it. John McCarthy said that he never rolled with anybody on the mat as strong as Mark Coleman. He said Coleman is scary strong. And you remember John was a power lifter who could deadlift 800 pounds, squat with 800, and bench press 480.
Oh. And he's a twin. He's got a twin brother.
Yeah.
Built just like him.
He said, I hated to roll with Coleman. He said, so strong. Rickson Gracie was smart. You got to remember, Rickson was a middleweight. He was 185 pounds.
Okay. I want to throw a name out at you because around here, where you mentioned a couple of UFC around here, a guy named Joe Silva pops up. What do you remember about this guy?
Joe Silva?
Yeah.
Are you talking about
the
matchmaker?
Matchmaker, Joe Silva.
Well, I got to tell you something. Joe is a very smart guy. He had been a production assistant for Semaphore, and Semaphore met him because while there was no real internet back in the days, guy, there were community bulletin boards. And Joe Silva was one of these guys who was an avid, crazy, lovable fan on the bulletin boards. And he met Campbell McLaren on this bulletin board. Campbell called me and said, I'm going to have the kid come out, and we use him as a towel boy. We use him as a production assistant. And that's how I knew Joe Silva. I took him out for the first steak dinner he had ever had in a restaurant. True story. He'd never been at a restaurant and ordered a steak.
Jesus.
Joe was very smart. In fact, he figured out the guy who eventually did my job as well or better than I did was Joe Silva.
Wow.
In 2013, I was invited by Dana to come out to the 20th anniversary show. And I hadn't seen Joe Silva in years. And Joe stopped by. I was sitting next to Horion and next to Campbell McLaren. And right behind me was, what's the actor's name? From I can't think of his name.
The Jiu-Jitsu Married with Children?
DiCaprio.
Oh, okay.
Sitting right behind me. Okay? And Joe Silva stops. He stops right by me. And I went like this to him. I said, you did a great job, Joe. And he nodded. And that's the last time I've seen Joe. But I got to tell you something. Very smart guy. And I have nothing but good things to say about him as I look back on it.
That's good. That's good. I like to hear stuff like that. So did you watch Goker's only MMA bout?
No. I knew Goker from the gym.
I suggest you give that one a look on YouTube. It's interesting.
Well, tell me what you think about that, Mike. I'm curious your opinion as a promoter.
I think Goker won before the bell rang is what I think happened.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Yeah, it was a Gene LaBelle promoted show. They promoted the fight as him facing Mr. Maeda, like the Rings Maeda, Akira Maeda, but it turned out to be basically like Joe Maeda, a bodybuilder from Hawaii. And the kid looked real good, but Gokor did what he did.
You got to remember that early on, one of the things that, and Horion giving me such clear credit, so you go do the matchmaking and booking. The world that I grew up in back then, you would see somebody in Black Belt magazine telling you that he knew how to do the death punch. George Dillman was doing seminars, some sort of pressure point that he could knock you out. There were guys like Emin Bostepi, who once threatened to sue Horion because Horion had made some comment in one of the magazines about his legitimate kung fu ability. So the world was full of these guys who were undefeated. So you're telling me about Gokor's true MMA match doesn't surprise or shock me, because remember that a lot of back in the day, a lot of guys hid behind this mythic reputation that they had. Oh, what I do is, you die. I said, my agreement says that if they die, you're covered.
Yeah.
You're covered. We got the insurance, we got the land, but we're covered. So early on, the friend and I that Horion and I had that we agreed on was it was fun to expose people on some level who were actually full of soup,
Yeah.
And in this situation. I'll tell you who I finally recruited. Dillman had a guy named Ryan Parker who was 6'3" and 230. Supposedly he was one of Dillman's greatest students. I made sure at one point I recruited him and put him in the UFC. He didn't make it out of the first round. So, Sarah Leone, who in the first UFC, shows up in my office. He is the title of Murid, Harriman style of Pencak Silat, the first European who win in Jakarta. And he looks like a cross between Antonio Banderas and a Jaguar. And I'm thinking to myself, I want this guy in the UFC. He wouldn't come in UFC 1. So I made sure I got him in UFC 2. I put him in with Remco Pardue. And he had a beautiful manager who was an executive with United Airlines at LAX. Beautiful girl. And after the bout where he lost, I had let him use my dressing room to dress him. We were really short of dressing. I let him use my dressing room. I went back to the dressing room. He was sitting in there sobbing like a child. And his manager said to me, he can't talk to you. He can't talk to anybody. They went home that night. They went back to the hotel. They got their tickets. They went to the airport. They went home. It took me 3 weeks to finally get his check for the loss to him. It destroyed him.
Wow.
He was going to go into this event. He had been the Murid, M-U-R-I-D, the winner of all Indonesia, all Southeast Asia, Pencak Silat tournament. He was Tiger style, Harriman style, Arturo. He said, I could kill people with what I know. I said, we're covered. We're covered.
Good. Don't worry. Yeah, kill everybody. We're good. Hey, so UFC 12, we had mentioned it earlier in the interview, was originally slated for New York. A lawsuit takes place. It doesn't fall favorably on your side, and the event gets moved to Dothan, Alabama.
Mike, who basically killed that event, was Extreme Fighting.
Okay.
It was the one that was partly owned by Bob, the guy who owned Pet House. I can't think of his name now. But they had announced that they were going to do an event in New York City. We were already booked and had already sold thousands of tickets, 4,000 tickets in Niagara Falls.
Yeah, Niagara.
New York. Bob was right. He said, if we do this event in New York City, Rudy Giuliani is going to go bananas. And that's exactly what happened. He got on TV and said, I don't care what the legislators in Albany say you can do. You ain't going to do one of these human cockfights in New York City. The next day, the New York Times echoed that exact sentiment and said, this is the most barbaric show in TV history.
You know,
so thank God that Semaphore had a backup plan. It wasn't my backup plan. It was their backup plan. We moved the event in short notice down to Dothan.
How far? Okay, we say short notice. And first off, that human cockfighting title was fantastic advertising. So for you guys, even though it hurt you guys location-wise, but it gave you guys a lot more eyes, looking at your product. So what type of time frame is lose venue New York, go to Alabama?
Wednesday.
Okay, so now let's talk about the real heroes of that event. Obviously, the scramble with the office guys are incredibly important. So we're talking a Wednesday, and this event's on a Saturday.
No, Friday.
Oh, my God. Who drives the cage down?
Well, the decision was made basically by Thursday morning that we were going to move, and we were going to wind up renting planes. We were going to send the Octagon and the production crew down on one plane. Michael Abramson and I, who's the head of marketing, we're going to go down with the fighters on a separate plane.
Oh, my God.
They drove.
Thursday. They would send the Octagon and everything down to Dothan. I think they were trying to get they wound up renting a plane from the Marine Corps, a C-130 at one point. We went down on rented public planes going down on Thursday, Michael Abramson and I and the fighters. So that decision was made Tuesday after breakfast and before lunch. And we had to react on that and get everything moving by Wednesday afternoon. And by Thursday, we had to be done. I did not go to bed Thursday night. Michael and I stayed up all night, and we put the fighters to bed. And we said, you guys go to sleep. And the next morning, I went and took some guys over for HIV tests. And then we took them over at 3 o'clock for the dress rehearsal. And then the show began at 6 o'clock on pay-per-view.
Wow.
That is bonkers. That must have taken years off of your life. That stress.
I give credit to the fighters. And like I said, Shamrock's telling the story on the plane. The original agreement was this big, and now it's this big. But I give credit to the fighters that they all stepped up down in Dothan. I remember Wednesday night getting on and doing a radio interview with a station in Dothan, and I played the Yankee. I said, look, we want to come down to the South where you guys know about a war between the states and you guys know how to fight. And we want to bring fights down there where you. He said, we love talk like that. We love talk like that. So I went to a radio interview with the number one disc jockey in Dothan Wednesday, and we wound up with a sellout, 3,400 tickets, I believe, in Dothan Friday night. We had to give back 4,000 tickets in New York. We already sold 4,000 tickets here in
Now, just for the record, in Denver, the UFC 2 venue is Mammoth Gardens.
That's it.
We talked a little bit about that. And with the transfer of all the UFCs and stuff of that UFC down there to Dothan, then that set off a whole period where you operated in the South. Like you went to Georgia and Mississippi, and then all over the place.
You stayed
and it became your home.
Miguel, here's the interesting story. We did UFC, what was it, 10? We did it in Detroit, right? Mm-hmm. And we said, we did the Cobo Arena, was a sellout. And Thursday, Bob Meyerowitz and John McCarthy are standing in front of a judge who says, I'll tell you what, I'm going to let this event be held in Detroit, but you have to promise me there'll be no closed fist punching on the event.
Okay.
So Bob goes over and gets a hold of me, Mike, and he says to me, it's your job to tell the fighters that they can't do that. So during the fighters meeting, McCarthy steps up there and he says, Art wants to talk to you. I was the UFC commissioner. Art wants to tell you guys something. I said, tonight, if you guys punch with a closed fist, I'm going to fine you $100 for each punch you throw. And then I kind of went like this. I had my hand and went like this. And McCarthy's winking at them. McCarthy's standing behind me, who's 6'4", and he's winking at them. So the fighters knew that Art says he's going to find us. Remember that Mark Schultz, the wrestler, gets in with Gary Goodrich, and he throws 41 unanswered closed fist punches to Gary Goodrich in beating him. Monday morning, the judge issues a bench warrant for my arrest.
Oh, so this is true.
To Michigan for 17 years.
Wait, wow. Art, you're kind of breaking up. You're breaking up. So the judge issues a warrant for your arrest in one more time?
Monday morning, the judge issues a bench warrant for my arrest. USA Today says promoter flees to California. They're still looking for him in Michigan because I didn't collect the fines. And the guys punched that night. The guys punched in the arena.
All right. So I'm just going to be very direct with you. When we do these interviews, and we do really long form interviews, and we usually we get a good like little rhythm, and then I look through a fighter's record, and I always find a sore spot, and I go, "Hey, Chris, when I hit this one, dude, it's going to be a shoot interview."
But where's my sore spot, Mike?
This guy's going to lose his shit.
Where's my sore spot, Mike?
This was it. See, UFC 9, in essence, I've heard that story nonstop, and Art, I believe you. So let me just clear the air right now. I believe you're telling me the truth.
UFC
but
9,
when I hear Dan Severn, yes, Dan Severn's name, and then you hear about his opponent's name, Ken Shamrock, they have been involved, allegedly. Well, Severn has been obviously confirmed by many times of being in fixed fights. So when I hear Dan Severn and Ken Shamrock say, "Oh, well, we couldn't fight because we would have got fined, $100 a piece," I'm like, well, I watched the whole rest of that card, and there's probably about, $300,000 in uncollected fines. And on that same card, you've got Schultz, who you have said was paid $50,000, and these people all know each other. In my opinion, without hearing this prior, I was assuming that you got two pro wrestling types looking at each other going, this guy just got paid 50 grand, which is probably more than they got, saying, I think we can get some more money out of these people. Let's concoct this story. I honestly had thought that fight was a work. That's my truth.
I got to tell you that it was not a work in the sense that it was set up by us as a promoter, but I'll tell you this. Severn is one of the nicest and smartest guys I ever did business with. He never fought for the crowd. He'll admit that to me. He'll admit that to others. He was not there to make the fans excited. Severn was a very smart guy who would always figure, what do I got to do to win? And not anymore. I personally think that he and Shamrock may have had maybe an unspoken understanding. And by the way, our pay-per-view numbers dropped because of that show and lasted for the next 2 or 3 years. Bob and I talked about the fact that one super fight was a hard blow. I personally think there was some sort of, I think that Severn was only going to do what he needed. And, Shamrock, I used to say, I never knew which Ken was going to show up. I used to call him Hamlet in tights. He was Hamlet in a red Speedo. I never knew which Ken Shamrock would show up. Because when Shamrock would show up and he really wanted to do something, look about the fact that he didn't want to be involved with Harold Howard. He walked away from $60,000. He and his father didn't talk for 3 months after that show. I know that from Bob Shamrock before he died.
Well,
crazy.
Yeah, it's got work written all over. It really does.
I don't disagree with you.
And your opinion is that it was not a work.
Well, it was not a work in the sense that we as promoters set it up.
What is your opinion of those two? Do you think those two just kind of had
I think for that bout, I agree with you. I think it looks like a work, and if it smells like a duck, looks like a duck, and flies like a duck, it's a duck.
So Chris, this is why these East Coast guys are so good. They're so good to talk to. They really are. They don't lie to you. They don't lie.
Mike. Okay, Mike. Now I know we talked about. We're well over an hour and a half right now. Do you want to kind of come up with your last couple questions? And
okay,
Art, can we keep going?
No, I'm up. I just don't want to steal all this time, man.
I said to Sean, you know why I'm doing this thing? Chris Lytle.
My man.
I think he should be in the Hall of Fame.
My man.
And I got to tell you, you look at his record, you look at the 31 wins, you say to yourself, this is a guy who really gave. He was one of the great welterweights, one of the greatest.
Thank you. Wow.
Okay.
Okay.
So
I'm humbled right now.
Let me just do one more question. Let's just start throwing some names at him then.
Sure.
Okay. So eventually, and you are our eyes on this situation. You got Royce, Helson, Hicks, and Carlson. They all eventually go their own ways. Henzo, they all go their own ways. Was there bad blood there? Or do you think it was just a business decision made individually? Because up until this time, Horian kind of kept everybody together, and they had a family pot where they all put their money into.
Horian had a black belt in Philadelphia. I can't think of his name now, him and his wife. And I said to Horian at the time, you should set up the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu Federation. I was encouraging him to do what Huron and Henner eventually did. And Horian had the hardest time staying with all of his brothers. He once told me that he and Helson finally fell out. And they went through 2 or 3 years of not talking to one another, some deal in Hawaii that went south. I tell you the story about Rickson taking some privates and teaching them, and that was the fallout between Rickson and Horian. The funny story about the Gracies is they form a firing squad by making a circle.
We mentioned Joe Silva. Now, what was your last UFC? Which was the last one that you actually did?
Was UFC Japan. And the funny story is that I had been talking to Andy Anderson down in Texas, and Andy owned a bunch of strip clubs, and he became very close to Bob Meyerowitz. Bob eventually paid for a lawyer to help him with that prosecution, which put him in federal prison for 35 years. And Andy had told me, in June or July of 1997, my non-compete had expired. I could now go out and start a new show. Now, I had been working for 2.5 years at that point as the matchmaker booker after we sold the UFC to Semaphore, but now my non-compete expired. And I had people coming to me saying, it isn't sanctioned everywhere yet, obviously, but would you be interested in starting another show? Andy Anderson down in Texas said to me, I got a lot of big Texas millionaires that would like to put money into you. And he said, I have a funny feeling McCarthy would follow you. He would come over there as the referee. So the true story is that a number of people who were writing a book, in fact, I think I've got the copy of the book here in my office. One of them had been talking to Joe Silva, and Joe had heard something from Andy Anderson. Andy, I think, was real close to Bob Meyerowitz and finally said to Bob, I've got a copy of a plan that Art has written. So by December of 1997, Bob said to me, finish up the whole booking of the Japan show, which was, again, Frank Shamrock versus Kevin Jackson. Great bout. One of my favorites, Frank Shamrock. A lot of charisma, guys. And, but after that show, he said, I don't want you to come to Japan. I knew what was up. I knew somehow that people had probably gotten him and said, Art is probably looking at doing another show. My non-compete. Yeah. In January, Bob calls me up and said, Art, it's time for you to go, isn't it? I said, yes, it is. And right about that same time, I got a call from Kazuyoshi Ishii, who owned K1, and he hired me to bring K1 to the Mirage in 98. So that was the end. The last UFC for me was UFC Japan, December of 1997.
Okay. So So let's throw a couple names like Harold Howard and Royce Gracie. Royce Gracie gets injured against Kimo Leopoldo.
Yes.
Instead of pulling out of the tournament, he goes in, bell rings, corner throws the towel in. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. That is not a win on Harold Howard's record.
No, it really isn't.
Okay. Do you think he won that fight?
We were all of us, babies learning how to do this as we were doing it. And you look back on it, that was obviously a mistake. The truth is that Royce had collapsed in the dressing room. He wouldn't let me in the dressing room. He was on the table. Again, no Rickson. So he's by himself. And Horian says to me, give me more time. I said, well, he's going to be in the final. So Horian finally walks him out. They bring him out in the Gracie train, and then they throw the towel. I was as shocked as anybody because I couldn't imagine him going to the arena and not going into the Octagon. I knew nothing about they were going to throw the towel. I knew Harold Howard because Charlie Anzalone, he was my tomato soup can guy. Anytime I needed a fighter on short notice, I called Charlie up. Before he became an inspector with the Nevada State Athletic Commission, Charlie Anzalone was my tomato soup can guy. I would call Charlie and say, Tony Fricklin, there's a guy. Tony Fricklin came from Charlie Anzalone. Harold Howard came from Charlie Anzalone.
So, in essence, like from the armchair, I'm sitting here going, he was injured, wanted that payday, went in, rang the bell, threw it in, and it was more for financial than anything, rather than putting in an alternate at that point. That's a win. Chris, that's a win, brother. Harold Howard, that's his biggest win.
Yeah.
Didn't throw a punch. Yeah.
No, fastest UFC win ever.
Yeah. Very sad. But as I said, we were all learning how to do this as we were doing it. And you see how far MMA has evolved in the last, especially the last 5 years. It's stunning to see the evolution. The sport evolved, fighters evolved, and the old spectacle promoters like he retired.
All right, UFC 7, Francesco Fang Maturi. Where does he come from? How does he end up there? And Chris, I'm done. I mean, I know I've worn out my welcome.
You're fine, brother.
Okay. How does this happen?
I was always inundated by black belt school owners who would send me some application and say, I knew what they wanted because if they could get on television, what would that do? If you had 100 students, now you'd have 300 students in Sheboygan or, Fort Wayne, Indiana. Come on. I understood the game. And by the way, Indianapolis, Chris, Indianapolis.
My man, what's up.
So I always knew that was so Francisco Fang Maturi. I think I don't know where I think I came up with the name Fang. You got to remember that I gave David Abbott the name Tank.
I know that.
Huh. I didn't know that.
There you go.
Yeah.
So where do you get him from?
I was in the Marine Corps with a guy named Tank Adams, who was a great brawler. And when I met Tank Abbott, he came in. It was David Abbott. He came in wearing a chino slacks and a button-down shirt, and he had a bag with him. He said he wanted to fight whoever I had that day, and I was sitting in my office. I said, "I got a secretary and a reception to the door. What are we talking about?" And I talked to him and realized that he was out there in the state parks brawling on the weekend. So I went out and saw him. A whole bunch of guys would show up, $1,000 in my jeans, $1,000 in your jeans. They would turn on all the car lights in the parking lot, and Abbott would get out there and kick his ass. I said, "You're in the UFC, baby."
Jesus.
So now we've gone through a myriad of crazy UFC. What was the craziest UFC event? Because I mean, we haven't even touched on Puerto Rico or the chupacabras and what was going on there. So what was your single memory?
I think that Mike is right that the wildest UFC really was UFC 2.
Yeah.
UFC 2 was just off the charts. The Mammoth Event Center, crazy venue. We were making this up as we went along. Thank God we had enough ambulances. But that event, it stands out maybe of all of them. And that event, more than any, has my own personal stamp because Semaphore didn't know about it until they got into town that we were doing 16 men and not 8.
That's too funny.
Wow.
Now you mentioned Joe Silva, and obviously, he put together a career that's legendary at this point.
Yes.
But Bob Martowitz, after you left, made the decision to bring a rival, John Peretti. You mentioned the Extreme and how they were caused you guys to mistake. What's your opinion on Peretti?
Well, you know, the truth is I've never met like Frank Dukes. I never met Frank Dukes personally, who says that he did meet me once. And I've never met Peretti. I've never even talked to Peretti on the phone. But got to remember that Peretti was with an outfit that had announced they wanted to do New York City, and that created some real problems. But Bob needed somebody to do what I was doing. And quite frankly, I was the only guy who was actually doing it. So my on-the-job training was my only qualification. I was doing a job that I invented. So in all fairness, Peretti had been the matchmaker for Extreme, and it was logical for Bob to bring him in. Remember, though, that Peretti, who was actually interviewed at one point by Lorenzo Fertitta, somehow that didn't click. And the guy who did click was Joe Silva.
Yeah. Yep.
Makes sense. Okay. You know, Art, you know, what you've done has changed all of our lives. I would just like to give, you know, both these other guys a chance to give a couple minutes to, you know, kind of let you know what you've done for them. Miguel, Mike, whoever wants to go first.
Miguel, go ahead.
Well, you know, Art, I did a little matchmaking, you know, for years and years, and I got to say that your style definitely was something I definitely tried to mimic. You know, that idea of, you know, when I brought up Peretti because I wanted to ask about the nuances of you getting Coleman and Kevin Jackson, Dan Henderson, you know, and then Brazilians, Alan Goes, and I mean, you were into that mix, and Peretti gets a lot of credit because of the Contenders and things like that for finding them, but obviously there were a lot of you know, you were involved and out there as well. So that essence that you brought to it is the spark that you know, Chris saw in the sport, Mike saw in the sport, I saw in the sport, where we knew it was going to be big. A lot of that is your signature. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. You know, I was very lucky in that you know, Amory Batech, Alan Goes, you know.
That Batech Don Fry fight?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. I was always looking, if they were out there, you know, the only one I never said no to was the guy who was the Green Beret from Alaska, who I sent a ticket to, but he never showed up. You know, they call himself the wizard or the something, the guru. So most of them, I was always able to separate out the guys who were not good. I'm very proud about the fact that 9 out of the 16 fighters in the UFC Pioneer Wing of the Hall of Fame are guys that I developed and brought into the UFC. That's the thing I'm proudest of. And but I still look far and wide, and I was so lucky that, you know, again, the Don Frys, the Mark Colemans, you know, all of those guys.
Well, Art, I will say that, you know, what I saw as a child, watching what you did, lit a flame in me that has cost me a marriage. It has got me sued. I have sued people. I have met some amazing friends and family. I am saying that, Art, it's really meant everything to me. My friends and family will say something exactly opposite of, you know, this is possibly like maybe ruined my life, but I don't care. From where I'm sitting, it's the greatest thing. I'm 20 years, you know, as a promoter. Art, I can't explain to you, my friends, family, the people that I really consider like my closest people, I never would have crossed paths with had it not been for somebody such as yourself. And although my mother and father will say you have ruined my life and it is your fault, I will say that I am very happy with a ruined life because of you. And I'm sitting there saying, thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
That's awesome. And for myself, man, geez, it just, for over half my life, this has been what my life has really been about in many ways. So it's hard to really put it into words, but, you know, it's amazing to me. I've been to foreign countries and people will stop me and start talking to me. And, you know, without what you created and did, nobody here would know anybody about me. You know, I would have never met these guys. I wouldn't know half the people I know, or a lot of people wouldn't know who I am. So, but just not only about, you know, people knowing who we are or whatever, it's just the challenge that it's brought out in me and made me a better person to be involved with a sport like this. It's not even a sport about you fighting the other person. It's about you controlling what you're doing and the internal struggles a lot. So thank you for being able to bring that out, and not only me, but millions of people. And it's what you did. Just couldn't thank you enough. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks for joining us. Thank you for joining us too. This has been great. We're going to take a rain check just in case we got some follow-ups. We're gonna bother you again, hopefully.
Yes.
Absolutely, guys.
And I know you got, hey, do real quick, go ahead and promote your book right now a little bit right there. And I know you got some big things coming up. We'll hold that off for another time.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Check out the full interview on iTunes, Spotify, and all major podcast platforms.